Voracious by Keith Frady. Keith read quickly. He ripped a page out of its spine and stuffed it in his mouth, gnawing on it like a bone before swallowing. He engorged himself on the paragraphs, licked the sentences clean, sucked the marrow from the words. Keith's library lacked windows. A dim overhead and his laptop screen shunned the bare minimum light he needed to move around unhindered. Bookcases covered every inch of wall, and the books packed on these shelves clung to each other, asphyxiated. But most of Keith's vast collection huddled in piles and stacks on the floor without category or sanity. A mattress, tucked into a corner of this chaos, sagged with dictionaries, encyclopedias, and atlases, and Keith read at his desk, at his dining table, at his only piece of furniture. In front of him, an open laptop. To his left, a pile of unpublished manuscripts. He, as always, naked, revealing the bloody dots pockmarking the crook of his elbows. He tore out another page, gutting the manuscript with his teeth. The books watched him feast. The library echoed with the sound of tearing paper. He masticated the last page, swallowed, and finished his notes. In summation, the characters were ill-developed, yet managed to be temperamental paper cutouts. The plot meandered so thoroughly it seemed purposeful until the last tenth of the book picked it back up and followed it to its obvious conclusion. The tone wavered so wildly that it is clear which sections the author wrote drunk. Make the changes suggested in sections 1 and 2 if you want a popular, financially successful novel. Make the changes suggested in sections 2 and 3 if you want to win an award. Ignore them all and make the changes suggested in section 4 if you want both. Keith emailed the notes to his client. He picked up the next manuscript on the pile to see what he would be editing the next day. The front cover was blank, and when Keith flipped to the first page, he saw the novel start without title or byline. He had never received an anonymous manuscript before, let alone one without a title. Perhaps there had been an error when the manuscript was printed. Keith dismissed the irregularity and threw the manuscript back on the pile. He browsed the library for something to read, upended stacks by snatching books from the bottom, shuffled rejected books onto different shelves, and tossed both pulp and masterpieces over his shoulder. Settling on a rare 20th century fantasy novel that had never been reprinted, he sat on the floor and tore out the first page. The novel's world-building pleased him, and he read greedily. Keith suddenly stopped reading, a page halfway shorn from the book. There were 2 paragraphs that did not belong. The first read, Keith read quickly. He ripped a page out of its spine and stuffed it in his mouth, gnawing on it like a bone before swallowing. He engorged himself on the paragraphs, licked the sentences clean, sucked the marrow from the words. The second ended. The library echoed with the sound of tearing paper. The fantasy novel proceeded normally after this interruption. The stranded paragraphs must have come from a work that Keith had previously read and had injected themselves into the fantasy novel. This had never happened before, but Keith could think of no other explanation. He continued reading, albeit more cautiously, and finished the book without further incident. The alien paragraphs bothered him, but he was tired, and he had to use the restroom before going to sleep. He walked to the only other room in the library and unlocked its door with the key he left in the lock. The restroom consisted of 4 white walls lit by a bare, soft light bulb dangling from the ceiling, a nib pen on the floor, buckets of white paint, some of which were empty, and a paint roller. 2 of the walls were cramped top to bottom with tiny red words. Keith picked up the nib pen and faced one of the blank walls. He dug the pen into the crook of his elbow and pushed through his flesh. After a moment's drink, the pen was full of words. The pen scrawled madly, streaming across the wall. Sentences splattered, unhinged clauses darkening the floorboards. Large blotches slid out of him, stranding paragraphs on the fringes of the wall and congealed messes. The flow only paused when the red waste dried, and Keith cradled the pen deep into his arm for a refill. The pen released, and Keith closed his eyes with relief. Spent, Keith tossed the pen to the floor, then opened a can of paint to whitewash the walls without reading the fresh stains. When he finished, he left the restroom, locking the door behind him. Keith slept relatively well. He only woke twice to the pounding of the bathroom door. In the morning, Keith checked his bank account to confirm payment from yesterday's author. Keith's clients never needed additional notes to fix their books. Then began reading the anonymous manuscript. From the opening line, Keith was entranced. He felt fixated while reality moved in his periphery, like locking eyes with someone across a crowded room. The protagonist made him smile. The motifs caught him off guard with their subtle reverberations. Keith floated on the text, swept deep into the story. A nervousness gripped him. It seemed too good. Something was about to go wrong. The themes would falter, or the protagonist would never fully develop, or the metaphors would grow stale. But he read on, barely managing to swallow before shoving another wad of pages into his mouth. There it was, a flaw. The plot stumbled, missed a connection it could have made with the first act that would have enriched a major theme. But the book was not ruined. Instead, it somehow seemed more sincere. The flaw had not detracted from his appreciation, but accentuated it. It was not perfect, this manuscript. It was human. Keith blushed without knowing why. He opened his laptop and created a new document. He should have been jotting down notes as he read, but he had been too carried away in the story. He stared at the blank page and thought about the manuscript. Remembering the plot stumble, he began to explain how to fix it. He hesitated. If the plot stumble were fixed, then the book would change. Even if for the better, it would not be the same book. Keith deleted what he had written. Unable to decide what to do, he went to a bookcase and grabbed a book at random. He tried to read it, but he stopped a few pages in and tossed it on the floor. He sat back down at his desk and closed his eyes. He mentally reread the anonymous manuscript cover to cover. By the time he was finished, Keith was exhausted. He went to bed and fell asleep, grinning widely. A howling from the bathroom woke Keith from his sweet dreams, the door shaking so violently that its hinges rattled. Keith tried to get back to sleep once the noise died down, but eventually he went to his desk with a disgruntled finality and wrote, hating himself more with every word, the notes on how to rewrite the anonymous manuscript for financial or critical success. But when he finished, he could not bring himself to send it to the email listed on the last page of the manuscript. It felt like a betrayal, but his reputation would be tarnished if he lied by telling the anonymous author not to change anything. The money did not interest him materially, but his fee allowed him to live, read, and edit alone in his library. He compromised and added a final line to his notes. Personally, I find the current draft flawed but enjoyable and do not want a single word changed. He mailed the notes, and only then realized he had not used the restroom in 2 days. Even though he had only read the one manuscript in that time, he was brimming, and he ran to relieve himself, unlocking the door without hesitation. He jammed the nib pen into his arm and wrote down all 4 walls, the white drenched in red. Exertion and a lack of blood wore him down, his bones aching and his eyelids straining to stay open before he reached the 4th wall. He was lying on the floor, scratching the last line, when he passed out. Keith woke up to his blood boiling on the walls. Exhaustion clawed at his arms, held tight to his legs, agonized his every movement. The blood ran down to the floor, pooling around him as he crawled slowly to the seemingly distant and receding door. Angry words leaked from under the whitewashed walls, years of discarded blood seeping to the surface and streaming down to join their newborn brethren. The blood coagulated, and as Keith reached for the doorframe, a three-fingered hand grabbed his ankle. He kicked back at it weakly and turned to see an eyeless head shaking out of the gathering pool, a too large mouth gurgling a scream. Terror rejuvenated Keith enough to kick violently at the still forming arm, and he broke free. He slammed the door shut and turned the key. The door vibrated with a cry of shapeless words. Keith leaned against the door to shore it with his weight. He did not know how long he sat there, on the edge of consciousness, while the door battered, then shook, then stilled. Keith crawled to the nearest bookshelf, grabbed a book for nourishment. He crumpled the pages with tired fingers and read them with slow, methodical chews. Keith thought he read a strange section that did not belong. It began. He masticated the last page, swallowed, and finished his notes, and concluded. The library echoed with the sound of tearing paper. Keith read on without pausing to consider the passage, assuming his mind had concocted it in his exhausted delirium. Eventually, he had read enough to find the strength to sit up. By the time he reached the back cover, he felt well enough to stand. He went to his desk and began editing the next manuscript on the pile. Life continued as usual. Keith read books from his library, ordered more books and paint, threw out garbage bags full of hollowed-out book spines and empty paint cans, was mailed manuscripts, edited them, got paid, relieved himself in his restroom, slept with frequent interruptions from the thing behind the door, and, about once a week, he read the anonymous manuscript. A year passed like this. Keith rooted in the quotidian. One day the doorbell rang, and, since Keith had not ordered anything, it had to be a new manuscript. Next to the door was a rack where a bathrobe hung, and on top of the rack was a shelf housing a pair of sunglasses. He put these on and covered himself with the robe. Then he took a deep breath, braced himself, and opened the door. Outside was pain. Keith shut his eyes against the oblique light and pawed at the ground for the package. Through the sunglasses, through Keith's closed eyes, the light seared his retinas, hammered against his skull. He dropped to his knees, scraping them against the cement of his doorstep, scrambling around until his fingers bled. It was the mailman's first day on the job, and he was behind his schedule. In his haste, he had accidentally knocked the package onto the walkway after ringing the doorbell. He had almost gotten back to his truck when a pale, malnourished man with the longest beard he had ever seen opened the door wearing nothing but a bathrobe and sunglasses. The mailman, struck, watched as the man, apparently blind, ran his hands along the doorstep, growing more frantic until he was hurting himself. The thought crossed the mailman's mind that he could just leave, and the blind man would be none the wiser. He was now very behind schedule. "Here," the mailman said, pushing the package into the blind man's hand. Keith snatched the package and slammed the door closed without knowing the color of his savior's worried eyes. Keith forced his breathing to slow. He clutched the package to his chest and gradually opened his eyes. Once his vision readjusted to the dimness of the library, he replaced his robe and sunglasses on the rack and shelf. He opened the package, addressed simply to Keith, and confirmed it was a new manuscript. He removed it from the packaging, which he tossed behind him, and saw that the front cover was blank. He flipped it open and smiled. The novel began without title or byline. He pushed the manuscript he had been editing to the side and tore the first page out of the anonymous author's second manuscript. At first, he savored the manuscript, slowly chewed the pages one at a time, sipped the sentences, swallowed the words with a content sigh. But the manuscript had an immediacy underlining the diction. The plot, which had been teased out in the first book, overwhelmed him with its urgency and passion. He wanted to cherish every phenome, but Keith was soon devouring the manuscript. By page 20, he had an erection, and he was shivering at the book's conclusion. He turned to his laptop to write notes. Keith's erection persisted. Giving in, he laid on his mattress and tore the word sex out of a dictionary. He closed his eyes, started rereading the second manuscript, and grabbed his erection. Like a river wearing down a stone, he licked through the word. Swallowing the rest of the damp pulp, he orgasmed onto his abdomen. Keith had never known another person's curves, but he retained his virginity in flesh only. As before, he added a final line to the notes. Personally, I find the current draft flawed but enjoyable, and do not want a single word changed. Keith read a bookshelf over the next 3 days without sleeping. During this mania, he encountered a section of writing in a 16th century philosophy manifesto that began, "The fantasy novel proceeded normally after his interruption," and concluded, "The library echoed with the sound of tearing paper." Drunk off insomnia, he mentally reread the second anonymous manuscript, and, satisfied, fell asleep as he read the last page. He slept through the next day despite the thundering door, but he awoke desperately, needing to use the restroom. He had to whitewash the walls twice before, emptied, he stumbled out of the bathroom, barely managing to lock the door before collapsing onto the floor. He woke to a storm. The door seemed about to break off its hinges as a roaring filled the library like a wind. It took a few hours of consciousness for it to die away. Keith tried to reestablish his routine, but he read books like he was trying to scratch an insatiable itch. His manuscript notes grew more vicious. He went from using the restroom once a day to once every few days, then to once every few weeks, and eventually ceased to go entirely. His dissatisfaction magnified to the point he quit reading. Hours, then days, then weeks slipped by without a single word passing his lips. He stared at the front door for long stretches of time, even though he never ordered anything. Starving and bloated, Keith withered away, and the library fell silent. Unable to bear it any longer, Keith opened his laptop. He did not know the name of the author or the titles of the books, but he knew every word of the 2 anonymous manuscripts. It was not likely to help, since the author had undoubtedly rewritten the works according to Keith's notes, but he had no alternative. He Googled the first paragraph of the first manuscript. The results led him to a book that was published by a small press and written by an author whose name Keith forgot the second after he read it. The book had garnered mixed reviews and had not sold well. Keith Googled the first paragraph of the second manuscript. The results led him to a second book that was published by the same small press and written by a person bearing the same inconsequential name. This one had created some buzz from critics, but had sold even worse. The publisher had regretfully informed readers that this second book was published posthumously. Keith had been an editor, locked away in his library, for almost a decade. Since his self-exile, he added around 50 books to his library every month. This figure did not include the manuscripts sent to him and his initial library, which was already incalculable when he first donned the nudity of a hermit. At a conservative estimate, thousands of books resided in Keith's library on the day he slammed his laptop over and over again into the corner of his desk. Then he read them all. Fewer and fewer manuscripts made their way to Keith's door, then stopped coming entirely. He was not aware of this because he never opened the door anymore, no matter how many times the mailman knocked and rang the doorbell. Nothing left. Nothing came. Keith read without pause. He did not go to sleep. He passed out mid-chew. When the raging behind the restroom door woke him up, he continued reading where he left off. Time became a measurement of words. And, one day, time ran out. Like waking from a dream, Keith found himself in an uncertain reality. The dim overhead light flickered. The floor was a graveyard of book corpses. A silence, a lack of tearing and chewing, rolled across his chest. Isolation pressed down on him like he sat at the bottom of the sea. And he was enormous with words. He was sitting with his back to a bookcase, and he grabbed a shelf to help him stand. He trudged to the restroom and was reaching for the key when the door exploded outward. It had grown over the years, letter by letter, and was now larger than Keith. It overwhelmed him, its eyeless face opening a too wide mouth as if to devour him whole. Keith pushed its face away, both of them screaming. They struggled around the library, knocking down bookcases, tripping over book corpses, overturning the desk, splintering the chair when it threw Keith onto it. Keith ran through the broken door into the restroom, and it slammed him against the wall, knocking the breath out of him. It ground his face into the white wall, tearing open his skin. Keith buckled his knees, letting his bloated weight carry them both to the floor. It straddled Keith's chest and wrapped its fingers around his neck while Keith's hands scrambled along the floor. It sprouted more fingers out of its hand, and they pushed against Keith's eyes, tore at his cheeks, filled his nose. Keith's right hand found the pen. He jabbed the pen up, pushed it past its rib cage and into the heart. The fingers withdrew. After a moment, Keith opened his eyes. He was alone in the white-walled restroom. With great difficulty, he pulled the nib pen out of his heart. He stood and emptied himself on the walls. When he finished, he sat down, blood streaming down his chest like ink from its overturned well. He pushed death away long enough to read, for the first time, something he had written. It began, Keith read quickly. It ended, Keith was slain by his own hand, and became the author of his life at the end of it. As he died, he became character, author, and reader. How much had he believed he was reading, when he was instead writing it from a concurrent future? He was living, writing, reading the penultimate sentence. He felt like his edges were perforated, and a thumb could push him out of reality with a sound of tearing paper. Keith Frady is a short story writer living in Atlanta, Georgia. You can find his work at Bewildering Stories, Drunk Monkeys, Literally Stories, Yellow Chair Review, and Love Hurts, a speculative fiction anthology. Follow him on Twitter at Keith_Frady. The music in this episode is by Sealand, and you can find more of their work at sealand.bandcamp.com.